I felt it in my gut that something was wrong, to the extent that there were two periods when I developed like lower back pain, right? I'm fit, I do yoga, like I'm young, and this stuff shouldn't happen to someone like me. It was entirely just due to the stress of the situation. And my body was screaming at me that like something is wrong, you know? And I just didn't listen to it for months until it festered to a point where it was almost, until I almost thought of leaving the company.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession Podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision: should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny. As a founder coach and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. What would you do if you built a company that literally created a new job category, raised from YCombinator and Andreessen Horowitz, and we're having best week ever, every single week? Well, Nate Tucker walked away. Today, the founder of Start Playing Games, the marketplace for professional game masters who earned over $50 million on the platform since its inception in 2020, talks about his experience of building the business to profitability and meaningful scale before choosing to hand over the keys to his co-founder and closing his laptop. This is his story. So, Nate, thank you so much for joining me. You built a very successful company raised from some of the world's best investors, YC, Andreessen, and others. And you had an amazing run over the last few years, and yet you are no longer CEO. I know there is a story behind all of this. Where do we start?
Yeah, I think it will be most fun to kind of go all the way back to the beginning and talk about how I started it and what happened along the way. And I think it's a fun story.
Yeah.
I started, and the business is called Start Playing. It's a marketplace to hire a professional game master. Game masters on the platform have earned, I think, upwards of $50 million. It's a professional job. Like, we've created a new job category. It's super fun. Oh, yeah.
Nate, for people who don't know, who is a game master?
Great question. So if you want to play a tabletop game online, sometimes you'll get a host, and that host will be called a game master. So our typical ones, so about 50% of the games that are run on the platform are Dungeons and Dragons, sort of that like classic Stranger Things type adventure. And so people will subscribe to a game master for what we call a campaign. And you can think of it like a TV series. And you'll come back each week for a new adventure until you build to a final culmination where you fight the big bad. Our adventures, I think, last around a year and a half. Like, we just pulled the statistic. So it's a while. So it's a long sort of TV series, long subscription. And folks on either side get different things. So game masters, this is a full-time job. Folks that are, that want to work from home, that don't necessarily have some technical skills, that have kids or parents that they need to take care of. This is kind of like the best gig economy job on the planet. On the other side, folks that want to play these games that don't necessarily have a friend group locally, that again, maybe are a little bit isolated, get that friend group. We've had people that become best friends as part of the platform. We have a woman that wrote a book as part of her adventure on the platform. We've had a marriage as part of the platform. We have a tattoo, which is kind of cool. Your first, customer that gets a tattoo of your company, I feel like that's like an achievement unlocked. So we don't have a baby yet, I don't think. We keep track, I don't think we've been around long enough to have a Start Playing baby, but yeah, that's what our platform does. And that's kind of why it's meaningful and important.
Yeah, but that wasn't your original idea. You started with something else.
So I think like many people, I applied to YC with, what I think folks would call a tar pit idea. I sort of thought a lot. I sat in an ivory tower and sort of conjectured as to what a good problem would be. And the problem that I settled on was something called Frequentish. We would build an iPhone app for a white labeled iPhone app for brick and mortar stores to allow people to get loyalty and eventually disintermediate credit card companies. So it's a cool idea. The cool thing about it was that there was no competition. And so it seemed like it was a green field. It was like really cool. And that's partially why it's the tar pit idea. There's this idea. I love this description. A tar pit, look, I'm not like a biologist, so excuse me here. This might be a little bit smudged. But a tar pit is this sticky, tarry pit, in the savannah that animals might get attracted to because there are these pheromones or whatever, good smells that come off it. And they're like, oh, wow, there's this oasis in the middle of a desert. It smells really great. Let's go over there. They go over there, they stick their nose in, they get sucked in. And because they get sucked in, they exude some pheromones or whatever. They make it more appealing for the next person because it seems like the oasis is empty. So similar to this, there had been many companies before us and companies after us with the exact same idea. And the reason there was no competition is because this space was very hard. So I remember after doing YC, like I would look at, our partner was Dalton, who's no longer at YC, sadly, but he's great. I would look at things that Dalton invested in. Each year after we went through, he would invest in a company that basically was the same thing as frequentation. And so like Evgeny.
But it's interesting that you're saying it's a famous tar pit idea, and yet YC, like one of the world's best early stage investors, keeps investing into a famous dead end.
I have a hypothesis about that. I don't know if it's true. My hypothesis is that Dalton had seen this as a good idea to attract great founders. I think so. He would invest in the idea, assuming that the founder was great and would pivot out of it. And I've talked to a couple.
Reminds me of Airbnb.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, it was funny in that way. I'm not sure. I never asked Dalton if this is like the true reason why he invested in this idea or whether he just wanted to see this in the world. But very fortunately for us, when I was building this idea, COVID happened. So I was selling to all these brick and mortar stores. I was going door to door. It was brutal, but fun. And suddenly all of these stores shut down. And so I had 11 different stores kind of running a simple pilot on this, trying to sort of build it out. And suddenly we had zero traction. And so it was just me and a product that was basically not working. And I had to make a decision on whether to do demo day or not. And so this was basically the COVID demo day. It was the first demo day that was not in person. And I decided, I think many companies there, that I just didn't know what I wanted to do. And I decided to delay it. So I think that was the batch with the most deferments of demo day. At that time, I sort of went to my idea list and I started pulling things from the top. And I will admit, this is kind of where I got very lucky. So the next idea was a silly idea. We don't need to get into it. But the idea after that was this marketplace for game masters. I literally looked back. I sort of did a little sort of archaeology project and I found this email that I had sent to myself. And I didn't think about this. This was a problem that I had previously, which is I had a group of friends. We wanted someone to run a game for us. And we didn't have anyone that could. No one had the time. And so I wrote down probably a year before I started this company, D&D marketplace for game masters. I put it in an email, you put it in a doc.
And you were a single founder at that point.
I was a single founder. That's right.
Yeah.
So I pulled it off the stack and I started doing what I think is incredibly valuable, especially for these product-led ideas. I started talking to people. So one of my favorite books, of course, outside of, startup founder successions, or whatever, one of my favorite books is The Mom Test. I'm sure you've had other people recommend this. It's an absolutely phenomenal book. And one of the things that they often urge you to do, and even YC does, is talk to users. It's talk to users and build stuff they want. So I picked up the phone and I started calling the smattering of professional game masters that had personal websites. So this was, if you can imagine, early days of bed and breakfasts. And you've probably experienced this as well. There were just personal websites where you would list your bed and breakfast and do this. I remember once I went to Scotland and, I had a bed and breakfast over there. This was awesome, right? Because it was like a non-Airbnb thing. It was like, yeah, he took out his, what is the name? Tarquin? What is the kilts thing?
I
Evgeny, I
think
don't know.
so. Yeah.
I think that's it,
Mhm.
and I remember we woke up and it was like 10 a.m. and he's sipping scotch, having a smoke, and he invites us. I'm like, okay, win in Rome, win in Scotland, do us the Scottish. So phenomenal experience. So I'd call up these game masters, and I called up the Houston game master. I called up the LA game master, because remember, all these people were doing it in person beforehand, but COVID shut them down. So everyone's scrambling to kind of figure it out. And I was getting pretty good signal as to this would be a good market. And then I called Devon, so Devon Chulik, who will come up much later in the story. So Devon was the San Francisco dungeon master, and he had a website and he had a Bloomberg article, which was talking about how he made some money doing game mastering. And I called him, and we both kind of remember this day because I got on the phone and I started user interviewing him. As a tip for other founders, don't just user interview people and not tell them you're user interviewing people. I was a very young founder. That can lead to some very fun things that happen. We could talk about that a little bit later on. It was the first time I ever got sued, was basically that. So I started doing this, and about 30 minutes into the conversation, Devon's like, is this a user interview? I'm like, it is. And it turns out Devon was a product manager in San Francisco, and he was moonlighting as a professional game master. Like, serendipity was high. And so he loved doing this. He ran and runs a TTRPG stream. So he streams this online on Twitch. And we just started talking. And so I think that conversation lasted a couple of hours. And he remembers this one funny scene where his wife walks in. She's like, because he left, they were watching a TV show, and he got a random call from a random number. He was like, I'll pick it up. And that's the type of guy that Devon is, And so he picked it up, and he's like, oh, I'll be back in a minute. And he's not back for hours. And so his wife walks in, she's like, what are you doing? And he's like, it's a great idea. I'll tell you about it afterwards. And it kind of started a really fun relationship. He had a list of game masters that had reached out to him as part of this Bloomberg article on, hey, how do I make this a full-time career? How do I do what you're doing? He wasn't doing this full-time. He was just, doing this locally a little bit, making a little bit of money off of it. So we had a list of like 30 or so game masters. And that list was the initial group of game masters that we put onto the site. So to sort of like combat the cold start problem, which is especially prevalent in marketplaces where you don't have supply and demand, that list was crucial. But what was more important probably was the psychological help. So Devon was working a job. He, like a lot of folks, he needed a little bit of stability. And so he was like, Nate, can I help you with this? But can I do it as a moonlighting thing? And Evgeny, I can keep going as well. I'll keep telling the story.
I can see how we're getting to the story of you getting sued.
So I go with, so Devon was like, okay, let's do this. And so really what would happen is that Devon and I would sync on what features to build each night. And I was always a good engineer. I was never a good designer. And so it would always be hilarious because I would show Devon the work that I had done. He was like, Nate, what do you think about like centering the image on the page instead of like putting it vaguely off center? I'm like, oh, you think that would look better? He's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. And so all of the initial design work and a lot of the product inspiration was Devon. And then a lot of the initial engineering work was all me, which is a little bit of a story on holding on too tight. We can talk about later on, but you can tell I can, yeah.
Yeah. But at that point, you did not agree, you haven't yet agreed to be co-founders. Even because he's got a job, you're in YC. How does it work?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I knew at that time that I wanted to work with Devon full time. I also had another individual that I had worked with at a previous company that also wanted some stability and income that I want to work with. He was the best engineer that I've ever worked with. So I had this goal of being able to work with these people. But in order to do that, I needed to raise money. And so you'll often see this as sort of like, I don't know, maybe you call it the traction triangle. We can coin that term if you'd like. But funding, co-founders, and traction all help each other. So if you have funding, it helps you get traction. Co-founders, if you have co-founders, it helps you get traction and funding. And if you have traction, it helps you get co-founders and funding. And so ultimately what you see is like they co-evolve, they're mutually helpful, but they're also it's kind of hard to cold start as well. So like you need to be able to get, one of those three effectively and then leverage that into the other one of the three. And so what was easiest for me at the time was getting traction. So Devon and I launched this product, and the product was you have a group of people and you hire a game master on the site. And functionally that didn't work. So we really tried to make it work. And that was the problem that I actually had. And Devon had known this space more than I did. And I was doing user interviews. I bullied my friends to join, but we couldn't get anyone to join outside of this. And Devon said, let's try this in a different way. Let's, instead of having full groups of people sign up, have individual people sign up.
Yeah.
And that one tiny change completely changed the dynamics of the business. And so we started by having one person sign up. We ran very small Facebook ads. And I think in May of 2020, maybe that was the exact time that this happened, we had our first purchase. So it was a random person on the internet, the first purchase.
So it was really fast from the lockdown, which was early 2020, to getting first money in the bank in May 2020.
Yes. Yeah,
and
that's
finding
correct.
Devon. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. In terms of raising money, in terms of startups, all this stuff, velocity and momentum are key, and this was what I really wanted to do. And so I, remember we were each night, we would talk about new features to build. And then I would build them during the day. When you're two people, when you're working on a small code base, you can move very, very fast. So we got these initial people that joined, and we did something that I think is like pretty clever, which is we wanted to make sure they had a good experience. So if you play a game with other people, you need a group, right? The group is the thing that makes it happen. If it's just one person in the game master, it's not fun. It's quite boring. So what we did is as soon as someone joined, we would bully our friends to join as well. And we would go in as kind of like, customers to kind of like white glove, make this great experience. And they had a great experience. Our cohorts, our retention cohorts for those first cohorts were incredible because they had a great experience. And, one of the beautiful things about the product that we built is it always had very high retention, but it was really high at that point. But when you get started, especially bootstrapping a marketplace, anything like that, you got to do these little things that don't scale. This obviously doesn't scale in the modern day. We built some tech stuff to actually help with this. But initially, you just can't. You just gotta, you just kind of gotta grind it.
Yeah. And from there, I remember it went up and to the right really quickly. Once you found the product market fit,
it
really started to grow.
It did. So we sort of we got that point, we got the product market fit. I remember, I think for demo day, we were doing $10,000 of GMV a month. And I looked this up, and at the time I was doing weekly updates to Dalton. I would send Dalton, our weekly GMV or something like that. Our week 5 GMV from launching was $580, which is minuscule, right? Each little
Still
number.
Real money. Yeah.
It's real money. People were paying for this product and loving it. So we launched during demo day. Very fortunately, we were part of YC, and very fortunately, I had a very nice pedigree, and we were able to raise. However, our demo day raise was very small. And I think this is, it's because the business seemed weird. People are like, this is weird. What's Dungeons and Dragons? That's weird. And so we got a couple of believers. And for the most part, we raised enough so that we could hire Devon and Jared, who are the two co-founders onto the company. and sort of make this the reality. This is like kind of common. I've at least heard, excuse me, this is kind of a common thing that happens, especially for kind of like weird niche companies, is that like they struggle very much so initially. We actually got a call with A16Z as well during demo day. And a little bit foolishly, I was very excited. They were always my top choice. You know, I very much so enjoyed reading, Mark Andreessen's blogs. You know, I grew up reading Paul Graham's stuff as well. But I took them as the first call that I did. You know, tactically, probably not the best thing to do. Like I was definitely a little nervous, and they decided not to invest. But the one thing that they did is they sent us a list. This is very rare for VCs. So they sent us a list of reasons why they're not investing. And if we could clear these hurdles, they would be interested in investing again.
And I take it they were actually serious about it. It wasn't just like a way to say no and send you away, but they gave you genuine feedback.
They gave genuine feedback. Yeah, they were definitely serious about it. And being sort of a first-time founder at that time, I didn't realize how hard the hurdles they set were. I was just like, oh, that's what we need to do. And so we set forth and tried to clear them. And we did. Start Playing kind of had 3 phases of life. We kind of had this initial phase, which was sort of post YC and until we sort of were able to raise from A16Z. It was us against the world, really. We had a shoestring budget. We were scrappy. We were, just kind of like what you would imagine most startup founders were. I kind of look back on that phase and I have like the most positive memories about that phase. And that is the, if we wanted to talk about like a cute story about, getting a quick cease and desist and whatever, I'm happy to go into it here. But that was the phase that happened. It was us against the world. It is really fun when you're in that us against the world, sort of constantly beating your drum, constantly growing. The second phase was us against ourselves, to be really fair. We raised from A16Z, we were flush with cash. And, not only that, we always ran the business very profitably. So, an option for us instead of raising for A16Z was just to run it profitably. So we had decided to instead raise. And after we did that, we definitely made some bad decisions. So most of those decisions were around personnel, hiring, culture. And I think that this, from what I've heard, this type of problem happens very often, especially with first-time founders. When I started work, I worked at, I guess most poignantly for me, when I worked over at Google, I was on a team and we were moving really slow. And I looked at what management was doing and I was like, we're doing just silly stuff. Let's do this awesome stuff. And so on month 2, there was a hackathon. I was just okay. I sort of gathered a team. We built out this pretty awesome product. Guys, we should do this. We won the hackathon. People were really excited. And then we shelved it, the entire thing. And I always thought that at places like Google, at places that are big, if everyone around the table had a voice, the organization would be run better. I still think that. And I think the best teams at Google are the ones, I don't think all of Google's like this. I think that there are some teams that just, some teams aren't as, efficient as others. But I think the best teams at Google, the best teams are ones where everyone does have a voice. My problem is I interpreted that in terms of I should Start Playing like a democracy. So, a very small number of people that are incredibly unified in what they want. Actually running like a democracy is pretty good. You got 3, founders that are crisp and smart and just dedicated. It's pretty good. When you build out a team and, getting up to like 15 people and everyone's got a voice and it's sort of chaotic, it does not become good, especially when you don't effectively hire for cultural fits. And so the company was being pulled in multiple directions. And then finally, we sort of got out from that and we got into what I would call sort of like the smooth sailing part of Start Playing, which is a little bit more about why I decided to do the transition. So, Evgeny,
Yeah.
what are you curious about? What do you want to talk about here?
I remember you wrote a really insightful essay on Substack summarizing the lessons you learned in that second phase about management, democracy, and building a healthy culture. What are your top takeaways from that time?
Yeah. So I think this does segue a little bit. There's a ton of takeaways. Most stuff is super contextual. Some stuff is very tactical. If I can be pretty crass, always interview, even if you get great recommendations from folks that you trust, you still need to interview folks. This is one of the things that we messed up on initially. We got some pretty strong recommendations for people that I think may have been really good for other companies, but weren't good for us. I think for me, I knew, well, my body knew that there was a problem. So I'm always someone that has gotten by on a lot of discipline, and I think there's a lot of people like this, which is you go to I think the simplest example, you go to the gym, it's unpleasant, but you keep going for months, and then eventually it becomes actually fun and pleasant, and you look forward to it. I'm someone that tackled hard problems because for the most part, hard problems in my life are worth solving. And both of those, I would say, skills, adaptations, I think adaptations are incredibly valuable and serve you very well in most environments, but not in all environments. So we had hired on employees and they seemed like they could be really good. And I treated it like a management problem. And I said, well, it's a hard problem. Maybe I need to change my management style. Maybe I need to do X, Y, and Z in order to adapt and make sure that they can fit in the company. And almost to a negligible extent, that will never be true. Throughout the entire process, I think probably other founders have experienced this as well. I felt it in my gut that something was wrong, to the extent that there were 2 periods when I developed like lower back pain, right? I'm fit, I do yoga, like I'm young, and this stuff shouldn't happen to someone like me. It was entirely just due to the stress of the situation. And my body was screaming at me that like something is wrong, and I just didn't listen to it for months until it festered to a point where it was almost, until I almost thought of leaving the company. So there was a point a couple of weeks before an offsite where I thought to myself, well, this is so painful. I feel like I'm doing such a poor job. Our product development, which, had admittedly been incredibly fast, had basically ground to a standstill. And, functionally, it was all my fault. I think this is one of the things that you need to realize as a CEO. So I thought that it might be best if I left and, gave the reins to someone else. I'm very glad that I didn't. I think I started to listen to myself a little bit more, and I had a conversation which was incredibly important. I hadn't talked to my other co-founders about this sort of like deep feeling of like the culture was wrong. And it seemed like they were okay with it. And finally, I don't recommend like this is not like you should drink, but over some drinks, in a casual situation, I just opened up. And I think that part of the sort of lesson that you need to know is, or what I should have learned from Google, is you need to, you don't hold all of your cards close to your chest. I don't think that's healthy. Be transparent. Talk to your co-founders, especially about these types of problems, to truly understand what they think and then take their advice to heart. You still do need to have like a singular decision maker, especially at a small company. But I talked to my co-founders and they opened up as well. And they were like, oh, Nate, I thought you wanted this culture. Like, I hate this. But like, it seemed like you were doing okay. And everyone had that same feeling. They're like, this was not the culture that we had originally wanted. It's not what we wanted to build. And we decided at that point that like we needed to do some major changes. So we did probably the hardest decision that I had done at Start Playing, and we had to let go of almost the company. Um, so that sucks, especially because, you know, it was, yeah, I mean, it was my fault. It was our fault that we had to do that, but it was the right decision. So, yeah.
Yeah. But it sounds like it was also a turning point that helped you to figure out what kind of culture you want to build and what kind of culture you want to avoid, and paved the way for future success.
It was. It was.
Yeah.
And so, and this is where I think that a mix of both, intuition and discipline is incredibly important. So if I had continued to just be pure discipline and was like, okay, let's, I'm going to fight through this hard problem. I'm going to solve it. I'm going to take this all on myself. I'm not going to trust my gut. The company would have failed. Absolutely. But I trusted my gut, and I opened up, and I took in evidence from the rest of the team around me, and we followed through on making these pretty tough, personnel decisions. But we also were incredibly disciplined. So I think sometimes people can just sort of act, which is they make this decision and they just go in a bit trigger happy. But we were very conscientious on, here's how we're going to transition. Here's the responsibilities that are going to be unfilled. Here's how we're going to be changing the hiring process. So we took 2 weeks after we made the decision to make sure that what we were doing was right. And at that point, after we made the decision, after the transition was sort of fully roadmapped out, the rest of it was just follow through, which is incredibly important, because if we hadn't followed through, I think we would have had quite a lot of attrition issues. And very fortunately, outside of the personnel that we let go, we've not had anyone leave after that. And it's one of those things that later on, as I was talking to people during my exit from StartPlan, I guess we've had we've had me leave. I talked to people about what they liked about Start Playing, and I think almost half of the people said that this was the best job that they ever had, which is, look, my goal is not to make that to be the case, right? My goal is to make the company the best it can be. But it's definitely really helps when a lot of the people there think they're doing really fulfilling and good work.
Yeah.
So we did that. And in some senses, it very much so aligns with the decision later on to make the transition.
Yes, which you just hinted at.
Yeah.
After that series of layoffs, you became the only person to leave the business. What's the story there?
So and I think that there were 2 definite points where I wanted to leave. One point was during this sort of middle phase of us making problems for ourselves. If I had left there, I think the company would have died as well. If there's any advice that I can give to folks that are thinking about doing a transition, doing it when things are going well, or at least stably, is much easier than doing it when they're not going well. So we finally got things going well. We increased product velocity back. We learned how to hire. We made actually some really awesome hires that were culturally really good fits. We built the team back up, and finally we were moving and grooving. And we took big swings that we had been wanting to take for years, right? So we built some really awesome stuff before A16Z. We made some bad hiring decisions. We ground to a halt. We did a lot of internal stuff, which was fine, but not super good for building a product for the customers. And then after that, we picked back up and started really building for the customers again, listening to them and really taking big swings. We took these kind of big swings, and we always do things in sort of a hypothesis, data-driven backed way. So I'm a data scientist by trade. We're a consumer company, so we have the data. So when we build products, we would attach a hypothesis to them, which is we think that this will improve the click-through rate by 10% on this particular flow. And then we see if we're correct or we're wrong. And it's something that we still do, and I still get this as part of updates, but we'll see. We had 18 hypotheses that we wanted to test in the last month. 14 of them were successful, 3 of them were unsuccessful, 1 of them was unclear or something like that. So it would be that type of research and that type of decision making. And we launched some big swings, and the big swings made incremental gains. At that point, the company was kind of running very smoothly. We were incrementally gaining each month. We were still growing, but the growth goals to make us, the next Facebook were not hitting. And so I, again, sort of was faced with a choice, which was, we have 2 paths in front of us. We can do a path where we really shoot for high growth, or we can do a path where we shoot for something that we've been really good at, which was high profitability. And so we had been profitable for years, and we had always just sort of stayed on that like margin. We didn't want to go too deep into profitability because, we knew that growth, especially as a startup. I think that the decision for me came down to the fact that I looked at the team, I looked at the culture, I looked at what we had built. And, you go to war with the army you have, like we could have done something similar, which would have been foolish, and, completely stripped the company down and changed the culture and really, really made it something that wasn't as mission driven, where people, really only cared about growth. But we built something where people cared a lot about product quality, about craft, and about margins. There's a really big, people really cared about like constantly building something that was profitable. And noting that the army was going to be one that would win the war of margins and profitability and building like an economically profitable multi-million-dollar business, I decided that would be the choice that we would make.
Yeah.
So in January of 2025, I had sort of made this decision in my heart that was the path that the company wanted to go down. And I felt that my job and sort of getting the company to a point where it could execute at a high level and achieve that result was done. There's definitely folks that are, that are builders, innovators, love working on new things. And there are folks that I wish they were better, the connotations of these words feel different in my brain, but, that are maintainers and stewards, like excellent stewards. And I was someone that wanted to be a builder. I wanted to be an innovator. I wanted to just really strike at new frontiers. And so I knew that, while I loved this culture and it was the best job I ever had, it was something where I thought that I could do better for me and do better for the world, partially by going somewhere else.
Yeah. So in a way, you separated your own path and your own destiny and your own set of aspirations with what the company was doing, where the company was going, and what the team was really good at.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not to just sort of like, go back to this sort of intuition versus discipline here, but, my heart was pulling me towards taking a break from start playing and towards maybe starting and building other things. So
yeah,
I learned that it is important to follow your heart. I mean, my idea behind this is that feelings are really good signals. They're a signal that something is wrong or something is right, or you should consider it. If you just act on your feelings, you will definitely get into a couple of problems. But if you instead introspect and understand, why am I feeling this? It can lead you to even better decisions than just sort of like your conscious prefrontal cortex can hit. So this is kind of where it comes down to a little bit more back to that discipline point, which is I had decided that I was going to leave in January, and then I left in August.
Okay, so you took 8 months to really plan everything.
Yes. And of course, as Evgeny is not saying here, I worked with Evgeny throughout those months in order to make sure that transition process was great. One thing that I have learned, and this is sort of like something since I was a kid, maybe like high school, and I call it meta learning, is that any problem out there are resources and tools for you to learn how to solve it. you know? I think this is a fundamental skill set of entrepreneurs. And the word I call it is undaunted. They're undaunted. They see a problem. They're like, how can I fix that? How can we go ahead and change that? And, you know, part of the problem with our culture at SPG before, sort of in that mid period, is we hired a lot of people that were daunted, you know, which is like really good if you're a legal person in a large tech company, because you want to be daunted. You want to be like, whoa, let's stop, you know, and like make sure we don't do anything wrong, but not good for a startup. Good for a startup. So as part of this idea of meta learning, and it's, you know, I've updated it because of LLMs and stuff like that. What I would always do is I would look and I would find all books and blogs on the subject that I could possibly read. And so I knew that I wanted to do a CEO transition. And so I started to read all of these things. And that's actually where I came across Evgeny, actually, and just sort of doing this research and reading his book. Very fortunately, as sort of also part of this meta learning thing, you ask folks around you who could be resources, what do they think? What do they know? And so I asked a mutual friend of ours that's like, oh, you know, I've been working on this thing, you know, do you have any people? And she was like, well, I might know Evgeny. I'm like, you mean the author of this book that I'm reading right now? And she's like, yeah. And so the connection happened. And so it's like, in one sense, it's very serendipitous, right? You know, it's like, I mean, that is incredibly serendipitous.
Well, yes. And at the same time, you made an effort. You found a book, you read a few things,
right.
You asked our mutual friend for a few connections.
That's exactly right. And so, you know, part of that is expanding your surface area for luck. You know, if you can roll a die one time and, you know, you need to get a 6, it's going to be very unlikely. But if you can roll it 20 times, you're almost definitely going to get one. So yes, we expanded that surface area for luck. We found, you know, what I would consider the global expert in basically what I was doing. And we got to work together on this process. And yeah, this might be a good time if we want to sort of dive into like very specifics of this sort of process. If
so
you'd like.
let's dive into some specifics.
Yes.
What were some of the challenges you were trying to navigate? What was difficult or interesting about your CEO transition?
So I think that there were two things that were difficult for me. So first, you know, not to just reiterate once again, but there was a little bit of this sort of like trusting the gut, a little bit of intuition, discipline sort of idea here too. So we wanted, if I was going to leave, we wanted to get someone that would replace me. And there was a lot of thought about who that should be. You know, should it be another founder? Should I look through the YC network? Should I look through a headhunter? Should it be someone internal? And my gut was always that Devon was the perfect fit for this role. It was always my gut in that case. And part of this process was sort of really evaluating each option. Like if we went with this, would it uphold the skills? Would it uphold what I wanted to be part of Start Playing? And we ultimately did go with Devon. And he's been perfect. It's been really great. But we understood why. I knew why I wanted to go with Devon. I introspected and we were able to really cross off the other options. So a little blend of intuition and a little blend of understanding of discipline here. And so that was hard, you know, because I wanted to just make the snap call of just like, it's going to need Devon. But as the introspection of around like, hey, you know, why is Devon the right choice? Or what am I actually looking for? It helped me in defining a lot of these tools that Evgeny and I worked together on, which was, you know, mission objectives, competencies, you know, what business KPIs matter. Like all of this stuff was derived from my fundamental understanding of what I wanted from the CEO, which was backed up by this little inklings of intuition that I had.
Right. So you built a framework and then made sure that your intuition aligned with your rational mind.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And look, those are the best things. When your head and your heart align, you are cooking with fire, I guess. Yeah. You're cooking. Yeah. So it is the absolute best when those two things happen. You know, I've experienced that quite a lot recently with sort of figuring out what I want to do next after Start Playing.
Yeah.
Let me just sort of very quickly talk about this other thing so that I think might happen with other people. So especially if you are hiring someone internally, you're going to think, well, they've been there, they know what they're doing, everything is going to be all right. And that is probably going to be true, but just relying on that without any backstops, I think is a recipe for disaster. So we did a couple of things to make sure Devon was appropriately situated for the job. So one of the things, this was very hard. We actually outlined his job description, but we outlined the conditions on which he would be fired, which is really tough because I've been working with him for years. And this was going to be a big transition in job responsibility, but we wanted to make sure that by outlining these decisions on like, hey, these are the things that are actually concerning, it clears up for him what he needs to do. It gives him a good understanding of the job, which that sort of like transparent, forward thinking helps him. Honestly, it might have helped him more than it helped me in this case, which is exactly what you want to do.
Yeah. So you found the language that allowed both of you to align on what is the job spec.
Exactly.
And if I remember correctly, from our work last summer, it also helped you to get out of the way, to make sure that the company doesn't depend on you.
Exactly. And I had learned the inklings of this early on. So I had built all of the initial tech behind Start Playing, and then I hired Jared. And Jared is a much better engineer than I am. And we initially worked together, but as he built out the team, we were starting to butt heads, which was I wanted to make specific design decisions that were different from what Jared wanted to make. And in the beginning, I was the expert on engineering because I built the entire thing, and I was the most knowledgeable person on engineering at the company. But when Jared came in, he was the person that was most knowledgeable. And not only did he build basically half, or if not more, of the functionality by the time that he was really running the team, but he deeply understood the code that I had written and deeply understood the frameworks and the stack that I did. And so there was this one moment that sort of, boiled to a head where I was like, we've got to build it this way. And, I could tell that, Jared was angry. And I worked with, at that point, this was not a Nate, solving this himself, but I worked with an executive coach that kind of coached me through, being able to let go. Now, I do think that there is some danger in letting go, right? And founder mode, which has sort of become pretty prevalent in the Valley, and I've talked to so many CEOs about this, of like bigger companies that I have built. It's so important to be able to get down in the details, run things yourselves, not be separated from the reality of a company. But if you're going to be leaving the company as a CEO, transitioning to just someone that's just going to be observing, you need to make sure to not put your hands in the details. So we had a specific month. There was a shadow month where Devon would shadow me. And every decision that I made, I would go into a room and I would talk through it with Devon. He would sort of understand my rationale behind it. And then the month after that, Devon was making all the decisions. Now, we did something that may have been good, may have been bad. We didn't tell the rest of the company that Devon was going to be doing the transition during those shadow months, because it still wasn't guaranteed. And we thought that it would perhaps cause more turmoil than necessary. And in some senses, does that sort of go against the idea of transparency? Maybe. But it was an excellent decision, because when we made that decision, everyone knew confidently what was happening. Because it's very scary when, the CEO leaves a company, right? You don't know what's going to happen. The ship could capsize and stuff like that. But not only did we tell people like, hey, I'm leaving, but we also let people in that like, hey, Devon's kind of been running the ship for the past one, which was fun because people would be like, yeah, I did think it pretty strange. You kept asking me to ask Devon's opinion on this one thing. I was like, right, so, people had hunches at the time that I was doing this, but I think for the most part, and again, after I left, we've had no attrition. So the company has been absolutely wonderful. As always, we have this little slogan at Start Playing, which is best week ever. And, last week was the best week ever. I was just hanging out with Devon on Sunday playing Dungeons and Dragons, obviously. And, he was showing me like, oh, we just hit our best week ever. It's always exciting. Each week being the best week ever definitely makes you happy.
That's for sure. So in a way, you made a decision in January, thought about it very carefully, did your research, created a transition plan, then dedicated a couple of months to making sure it actually works well, and this enabled you to leave, close your laptop, and focus on what's next.
That's right. And
Yeah.
so just for clarity, because if anyone else is going through this, I mean, number one recommendation, Evgeny is great. But just to show you the work that we went in is, I built out an MOC, business KPIs that we need to track on a monthly basis that need to be delivered, board consent matters, conditions for termination, our monthly review meeting, an emergency exception process, an annual financial plan. This is half of things that we sort of went down. So we were really, really thoughtful and dedicated about it. Maybe we were even over prepared for it, perhaps. But from what I've experienced, it's been great. I've had to do one, in the past sort of 6 months, I've had to help with one issue, which was, sometimes just crazy things come up, and this was a sort of a crazy issue that came up. But for the most part, I mean, Devon's been great. The entire company has been wonderful, and I couldn't be happier. For them.
Well done, you and Devon and the rest of the team. Nate, as we're starting to prepare to wrap up in the next few minutes, so what's next for you? Now that you've left the business a few months ago, what's next?
Yeah. So for me, what I wanted to do is I wanted to do some work that I wanted to expand my surface area for luck. And so I really took a step back, crazily, I literally took a step back and wrote my full autobiography to just reflect and understand who I am and what I wanted to do. The thing that I learned sort of about this is that while my head really wanted to do these things, I wanted, in my head, I'm like, I've got to step back, relax, take vacation, travel, write, do all these things. I'm like, I have to do this. My heart kept pulling me back into building. And so this month I've sort of finally taken that chance to be like, okay, it's my head and my heart have aligned, let me jump back into actually building something new. And it's probably the most exciting time that at least someone my age has lived in terms of building new things. The possibilities that exist out there. Yeah, it's a brave new world.
Yeah, and that could be a topic for a whole another episode, what AI enables founders to do in 2026. Cool. Nate, thank you so much for sharing your story. So glad that the transition worked out so well for you.
Yeah, very fortunate.
Good.
Thank you, Evgeny.
Thank you, Nate, and good luck with whatever you build next.
Thank you.
In my conversation with Nate, two things stood out. The first one is the importance of balancing intuition with discipline. Throughout the journey, whether the company was going through a pivot, or Nate was choosing Devon as his successor, or navigating some cultural challenges, Nate really trusted his gut, but he also thought very carefully about how to approach things. Both approaches really matter. And the other thing is that Nate really took care of preparing for the transition. He didn't just wing it. He took months to think about the job spec, success criteria, termination conditions. He invited Devon to shadow him. And the result of all this work is that the results speak for themselves. There is zero attrition, the company is running well, and Nate is not stressing out about how things are without him. So if you're a founder contemplating a CEO transition, I really hope that his story serves as an encouragement and a roadmap on how to do it well. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next episode.